Brutal truths about Europe Africans need to know, especially those who have never been to Europe. 1. Europe has no borders. Africans need to know that Europeans don't need visas to travel within Europe, and to further show you how Europe has removed borders even in Africa, Europeans have more travel freedom within Africa more than Africans themselves, meaning it is easier for Europeans to travel within Africa more than African themselves. Unlike Africa, where a Cameroonian needs a visa to travel to South Africa, Ivory Coast, and many other African countries, a German does not need a visa to travel to any country in Europe. This is to inform you that the people who partitioned Africa and implemented strict borders have no borders on their own continent. Europe is a very small continent. In fact, it is the smallest continent in the world after Australia, which is a country, but despite its small size, it is the richest continent in the world. In 1993, the European Union was formed, bringing together almost every major country in Europe, and one of the aims of the European Union was for Europeans to move freely within Europe without any restrictions and make it extremely difficult for Africans to travel to Europe. Africans cannot travel to Europe without visas, and getting those visas is a tedious and long process, and if you manage to get a Schengen visa, you can travel to every country within the Schengen area. In 2002, the African Union was created with the aim of uniting the entire continent, but since the creation of the African Union, uniting the continent has been a major challenge. The African Union has failed to unify the continent because movement within the continent is still very difficult and expensive due to the strict border laws. South Sudan, for example, is the poorest country in the world, but getting into South Sudan is extremely difficult, especially for Africans. Africans need to understand that opening their borders will ease movement of Africans within the continent, and this will foster the development of the continent. The African Union needs to sit up and unify the continent to ease movement. 2. Tourism is the best generator of economic revenue in Europe at the expense of Africa. For starters, European countries have the least natural resources in the world, so they have to depend on other countries for natural resources, and because it is difficult to constantly get these resources, Europe had to develop its tertiary industry, which is tourism. Till this day, tourism is a great generator of revenue in most European countries like France, Italy, and Spain. What Europe has done is that they have copied and even stolen all what is in Africa and have taken them and implemented in Europe. Most European museums are filled with African artifacts. Most buildings in Europe that attract tourists are replica of buildings that existed in Africa. They have also replicated the Great Pyramids of Giza and have used the power of mainstream media to market these things to the world, since they own these media and have control over them. As a result, a lot of people are flocking into Europe, and you need to understand that it is where energy goes that grows. Europe has used mainstream media to paint Africa in a negative light so as to discourage people from visiting Africa and encouraging people to visit Europe instead at the expense of Africa. Africa remains the place for the best real and authentic tourism because the continent has it all. From natural wonders to man-made wonders to beaches, Africa has it all, but the sad thing is Africans don't generate as much money from tourism because people don't really visit the continent due to bad press. 3. Europe is pay as you live. Contrary to what a lot of Africans think, life in Europe is extremely difficult and Europe is a tough place to live in. Europe has almost zero social life because you have to work multiple jobs to survive. The systems are designed in a way that it is difficult to own anything. It is difficult to own a piece of land or even build a house, especially for non-Europeans. In Europe, you have to pay for every single thing, and as soon as you can no longer work and pay, it is game over for you because you have nothing to fall back on. Whereas in Africa, there is always something to fall back to, coupled with the fact that there is a communal way of living in Africa. Most Africans in Europe will not tell you the truth, but if they had their way, they will return to Africa. If the economic situation in Africa is improved upon just a little bit, most people will relocate to Africa. The reason why people are leaving Africa is because of bad leadership and greed from African leaders. Bribery and corruption is what is holding African back, and if these things are improved upon, the continent will be the best place to live in and raise children. 4. Mostly poor people in Europe eat junk food, whereas it is the rich in Africa that eat junk food. Like we mentioned earlier, Europe is not particularly blessed when it comes to fertile lands and natural resources. They depend on fertilizers and chemicals to grow their crops and animals. As a result, their foods are not organic. Fresh organic foods in Europe is scarce, as a result extremely expensive to the point where an average European cannot afford. To eat fresh organic foods in Europe, you must be a wealthy person, whereas in Africa, it is mostly the rich that fancy junk food, because for some reason junk food is still expensive in Africa. For example, a decent cheeseburger can cost around $15 in Africa. Meanwhile, same burger will cost $2 in Europe. In Africa, junk food is more expensive than fresh healthy meals. In Africa, the rich deal with obesity and other food-related diseases due to the fact they consume the most processed food. Meanwhile, in Europe, it is mostly the poor that have food-related complications. Africans need to understand that eating junk food is not a sign of good living. Junk food causes a lot of health complications. 5. Loneliness and depression in Europe is real. In Europe, all you have to do is work, because if you don't work, you might be homeless. As a result, there is little or no time for a social life. In Europe, you can be with your family, but still feel lonely and depressed, because the free time they have is to rest and relax and not engage in activities. Depression is more rampant in Europe despite the fact that they have everything, like good working conditions, social services, roads, and infrastructure. Meanwhile, in Africa, people are happier despite all the challenges, because people have time to unwind, talk with friends and family, hang out, and just have people around. Thanks for watching this video. What other things Africans need to know about Europe that we didn't include in this video? Please drop your comments and we will pin the best comments. If this is your first time on the channel, do well to subscribe and turn on notification so you don't miss any of our videos.